Hello and welcome to the Friday, December 12th, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, recording today from Jacksonville, Florida. And this episode is brought to you by the SANS.edu Graduate Certificate Program in Cybersecurity Engineering. AI, of course, is the big issue that everybody is worried about and playing with these days. And, well, as a first touch point, you usually just use one of the public models like ChatGPT and such to get a little bit experience with what these tools can do. But it can be quite intimidating to go a step further and try to run some of these models locally and play sort of in a more intimate atmosphere with these particular models. Well, Guy now wrote up a quick diary showing how to install Gemma 3 on a reasonably small home computer. In this particular case, he used one of the new Ryzen chips and one of those mini computers that have become quite popular these days for home labs, and shows a couple of the pitfalls. Here are some of the problems that he ran into trying to make this all run in the Proxmox virtualization environment and how to configure it, and then in the end also how to use these tools. Certainly an interesting experiment and something that gives you a little bit more insight in how these tools sort of work on the back end. And then we do have an update for Chrome with yet another already exploited vulnerability being addressed here. And this vulnerability was, well, by some described a little bit sort of as a mystery vulnerability. And it's certainly a little bit an odd one in that there is no CVE number for this vulnerability. There's also absolutely no detail what it's all about. Now, Google usually at least sort of has these one-liners that describe a little bit something about the vulnerability, but here it just says under coordination. What I believe is happening here, and that's sort of where the coordination part comes from, that this particular vulnerability likely affects not just Google Chrome. There are likely either other browsers, maybe it's one of the underlying libraries that's vulnerable here. That is being exploited. So what's possibly happening is that they first need to coordinate with other vendors who are also affected by this issue before they're going to release any additional details and before a CVE number will be assigned. Also doesn't state who actually reported this vulnerability. So will be interesting. Maybe next week we'll learn more about this vulnerability. Until then, just keep Chrome updated. Well, in this week, we already had a couple SOAP-related stories. We have now one more from Watchtwr Labs, and that's SOAPwn, or SOAPwn, however you pronounce this, which is, I think, sort of a must-read article for anybody who is developing in .NET. Also, pen testers probably want to take a close look at this. The problem here is a fundamental weakness in how .NET deals with HTTP requests, or URL requests, I should say, and how this may actually lead in some cases to arbitrary file write or even to remote code execution vulnerabilities, in particular as SOAP is being implemented. So SOAP is the enterprise API language. And one of the problems here is that if an attacker can control the URL that a user is connecting to, if this URL starts with file : so it's actually referencing a file, not like an HTTP web page. Well, .NET has different classes that it uses for to deal with these requests, and they may be cast into one another, which then results in the user actually writing files on the server instead of, well, just requesting or posting some data from an HTTP API, which is interesting. And in some cases that Watchtwr shows here, like, for example, they have a proof of concept exploit for this vulnerability in Barracuda's system. Well, it is exploitable. The tricky part here is it really depends on how a developer implemented these particular APIs. Microsoft is not thinking about fixing this problem. They're saying it's really more a problem in how users are using their tools, so not so much a problem with how these tools are working. Watchtwr here is disagreeing with this a little bit, but still, as a .NET developer, you definitely should be aware of this and should take a look at what Watchtwr is demonstrating. And then we got a report from CISA summarizing some recent activity by pro-Russian hacktivists. Now, hacktivists, of course, are not necessarily state-sponsored actors, but more individuals who do it out of, well, the good or bad of their own heart. What I sort of thought is interesting about this report is it's labeled as being about global critical infrastructure. And when we're talking global critical infrastructure, we're thinking about, power systems and things like this. That's part of the report, but it also covers attacks against some smaller businesses, basically factories and such, that may not necessarily see themselves as sort of operating big OT networks and being part of a critical infrastructure, but have many of the same vulnerabilities, maybe more so because of the less mature IT and security organization that you often find in these smaller companies. So definitely worthwhile looking at this, in particular if you are working for any kind of manufacturing company that, for example, does have sensors and the like that are remotely accessible and could potentially affect your production line, for example. Well, and this is it for today. So thanks for listening. Thanks for liking, subscribing. And I saw a couple of you did leave comments in Apple's podcast app. So thanks a lot for that. And talk to you again on Monday. Bye.